Our speaker, Dr. Lise Eliot, is Associate Professor of Neuroscience at the Chicago Medical School of Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. A Chicago native, she received an AB degree from Harvard University, a PhD from Columbia University, and did postdoctoral research at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. In addition to teaching and writing, Dr. Eliot lectures widely on children's brain and gender development. And she comes to us this morning from nearby Lake Bluff, Illinois, where she lives with her husband and her children. So, you're welcome.
Thanks a lot, Carrie. Oh, good. I'm turned on. Okay. I'm going to stand down here, if that's okay, because I like to point at my slides, and that's a little too close. And I don't have a sermon, so I feel more comfortable. And I have to say, I'm really so thrilled to be here. I wish I lived closer. I wish we had made the trek down here with my kids. My kids are all teens, and actually my oldest is 21 now. I've got one still in high school, 2 in college, and I just think it seems like a really wonderful community. I was myself raised in a Unitarian church, the North Shore Unitarian. My husband actually, it's pretty funny. I went through my teens and 20s with friends who were so concerned about marrying a person of the same faith. I had no interest in religion, no faith. And my husband and I happened to meet each other in grad school. He was raised as a Unitarian. I was raised as a Unitarian. We married in a Unitarian church. Everybody was happy. Anyway, so, but I feel probably even stronger resonance with your community. Okay, so let me jump into it. I have a lot to say, and I know people's attention spans are tough, especially on a beautiful sunny day. So I'm going to talk about sex differences in the brain, a topic I became interested in after writing a book on brain development, and probably the fact that I've got a daughter and 2 sons. And when I started writing this book, which was back around like 2002, 2003, I started researching it. I myself was caught up in what I now call the popular zeitgeist. I was caught up in the idea, probably because I'm a biologist, that there's a lot of research in brain science about hormones and genes and effects on the brain, that there actually is such a thing as brain sex, that there is such a thing as pink brain, blue brain, which I realize is a mouthful. And this is a book from the 80s. It's still in print, and it still has wide appeal. And there's just been, I've got a whole shelf of books that essentially say the same thing. And basically, if you're familiar with this one, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, this is what they all say. They all sort of pick some ultimate stereotypical differences. Men like to hunker down in their man caves with their remote control and a beer, and women are just a bunch of chit-chatters that are only concerned with relationships. And then they find some brain basis for rationalizing it. And that's where I get into the game. So, like I said, there's just a shelf full of books, Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps. And you can pick through the scientific literature, and you can always find one study that supports your pet hypothesis, whatever it is. Often it's going to be like a study in rats, but nonetheless, people pull them up. So one person who's really guilty of that is Luann Brizendine. She's a psychiatrist at UC San Francisco. Very good credentials. She ought to know better, but she too has written these very stereotypical books, The Female Brain, which is made out of telephone cable, and The Male Brain made out of duct tape, and basically does the same thing. And so right on her book jacket for The Female Brain, she writes, "The female brain has tremendous unique aptitudes, outstanding verbal agility, the ability to connect deeply in friendship, a nearly psychic capacity to read faces and tone of voice for emotions and states of mind, and the ability to diffuse conflict. All of this is hardwired into the brains of women. These are the talents women are born with that many men, frankly, are not." So this is the key here, this word hardwired. This is the one that resonates throughout the culture. And when we talk about women, oh, it's fine, it's kind of sweet, women are so relational and we're so good at communicating. And But imagine if a comparable thing was written about areas that men tend to excel in, like math and science and leadership and courage and humor. You know, all of these things are hardwired into men that, frankly, women, we ain't got it, you know. So that would be obviously very politically incorrect. But nonetheless, it's really taken over our culture in many ways. And I just wanted to point out, as long as Luann Brizendine says that girls are hardwired for diffusing conflict, I thought you might be interested in some data looking, I'm going to show a lot of data, so looking at physical aggression across childhood. And so this was a nice large study of a couple of thousand children done in Canada. And what you see are boys in white bar, girls in gray bar, ages 2 through 11, and the parents are simply asked, has your child ever hit, bitten, or kicked another child? Well, guess what? Toddlers are naturally aggressive. They're selfish. And so at the age of 2, 47% of boys and 38% of girls have engaged in this behavior. So we have a very small sex difference. But I think what you see when you look across development is that children grow out of this behavior. Most kids get civilized. Most kids learn not to be physically aggressive. But actually, girls learn faster than boys. Boys are about twice as likely to engage in physical aggression in childhood than girls. But they didn't start out that way. They didn't start out twice as much. And it seems pretty obvious if you turn on television, especially today on Sunday, and you look at role models of physical aggression in the shoot-'em-up movies or in sports, boys are getting much more of a mixed message about aggression than girls. Girls can internalize this idea that we should be not hitting, biting, or kicking each other. All right. So definitely an over-extrapolation. And what really got me going, what really kind of flipped my thesis of my book midway through writing, was seeing what other authors were saying about sex differences in the brain as it pertains to kids specifically. So there are probably a half dozen or more authors that have written stuff like this, but Leonard Sachs is one author. He's a physician, but he's got some pretty conservative views, I guess, about the brain and gender. And so he's written a bunch of books for parents. This one, Why Gender Matters. He's written a book about boys, a book about girls. He writes, for example, in girls, emotions processed in the same area of the brain that processes language. So it's easy for most girls to talk about their emotions. In boys, the brain regions involved in talking are separate from the regions involved in feeling. Wow. Oh, that explains it. I mean, I've got a 16-year-old son, and I can tell you, he doesn't talk about anything, emotions or otherwise, but it must be because of his hardwired brain. And it's really fun to deconstruct Leonard Sachs, and myself and other scientists have done this, that this claim on page, 52 of his book is based on one tiny little study done of 19 adolescents. It wasn't looking at language. It was looking at the amygdala, which does process emotion. And so the whole rest of this was a huge extrapolation. It was a tiny effect, published in 2001, never been replicated. So there you have it, 19 kids. We have this big claim. But Leonard Sachs is training tens of thousands of public and private school teachers in this stuff, as is Michael Gurian, who isn't a clinician or a scientist, but really likes the brain. And he's written a lot of books about men and women, boys and girls, including 2 editions of this Boys and Girls Learn Differently. Boys and girls are hardwired. Gurian especially likes hormones. He basically finds any sex difference and explains it based on hormones. So, for example, girls have difficulty learning math because of testosterone. Surges of the hormone, which males receive during adolescence between 5 and 7 times a day, can increase spatial skills. So, again, in my book, I've deconstructed this. This is absolutely not true. Lots of people have looked at the effects of pubertal testosterone and estrogen on effects of verbal and spatial and math, and there's not any noticeable effect. But imagine telling teachers this. Imagine having your daughter's math teacher think that she can't do math because she doesn't have enough estrogen or enough testosterone. I mean, it's mind-boggling to contemplate the teacher expectations. Testosterone does have effects. I am a biologist, and I'm not going to stand up here and pretend that it doesn't, but it's the prenatal testosterone. And as I'll show you, I believe it's a little biasing effect. I don't think it's this complete explanatory mechanism of male-female differences. So this is the word to watch out for, hardwired. And you'll see it everywhere. And it's not just pertains to gender. It pertains to everything when we talk about intelligence being hardwired or talent. Talent is a very dangerous word. We hear it all the time about sports and math and so on, that one is talented or not. And, well, when I talk about brain development, I hope I'll convince you that nothing is hardwired, even what we call talent. All right, so this is the dogma. And we see it throughout our school system. Research solidly indicates that boys and girls learn differently. Unfortunately, if you ask many teachers, public, private, about gender in the classroom, this is what they'll tell you. They'll say, well, of course, boys and girls learn differently. And, I mean, there are behavioral differences. There are interest differences. But the actual mechanisms of learning, how does memory work? How does language work? How does our brain process computation, calculus, spatial? There is no gender difference, and I would be happy to, I think any neuroscientist who really looks at the data would agree with that. This, as I said, is being taught to our teachers. It's the basis of a new gender segregation system in the country. There's a lot of schools that are separating boys and girls in math and reading based on this kind of claim. So my question is, show me the data. So when we talk about gender differences, of course there are gender differences. Psychologists have been studying this for decades. Many of our stereotypes are accurate. The question is, how different are we? We have to talk numbers, okay? And so when we think about gender differences, we tend to think of something really obvious like height. Men are taller than women. Men are about 5 inches taller than women on average. Standard deviation is about 2 inches. And so statistically, we can calculate a really simple measure called a D-value, a difference score, or an effect size for the difference in height. And the difference in height between men and women, you can see there's not a lot of overlap. There's some overlap. I'm 5'9", so I'm taller than a bunch of men, but the average man is 5'10". So the difference of this very, very large sex difference gets a score of 2.6. That's 2.5 standard deviations different between the average man and the average woman. Now consider something, a psychological trait, like empathy, like, Luann Brisendine's going to go off about our ability to understand each other's emotions. Yes, women are more empathetic than men. If you ask women how empathetic you are and you ask men, you'll see a big sex difference, like a 1.0 standard deviation, but that's subjective. Of course, women are socialized one way, men are another. If you actually test people on how accurate are you at detecting fear or happiness in another person's face, you see it's a relatively small sex differences. Women are about 1/3 of a standard deviation better than men at detecting emotional expression. But obviously there's tremendous amount of overlap. And the reason I pick a difference that is at the 0.35 level is because Janet Hyde, who is a psychologist up at University of Wisconsin-Madison, has looked at hundreds of sex differences. And she's not just done single studies, she's done meta-analysis, which you may or may not know is when you don't just look at one study, you combine all the studies. You try to do an absolutely comprehensive search of the science for every study that's been done. For example, if you're going to take a drug, you would never just rely on one study. You would want to know what the meta-analysis says about every study that's been done on that drug. So she's done meta-analysis of sex differences, and she published a big study 10 years ago now that looked at 124 meta-analyses. So every one of these 124 effects, looking at things like verbal skills, empathy, moral reasoning, leadership ability, self-esteem, as well as some physical differences like throwing accuracy. And what you see is that what she found is, and she titled her paper The Gender Similarities Hypothesis, because basically the vast majority of our psychological traits are much more similar than different. So 3/4, 78% of all psychological sex differences are smaller than 0.35. There's more overlap than this for 78% of our psychological sex differences. There's a handful of things that do show effects up to a whole standard deviation. And again, these are things like physical abilities, physical strength, targeting accuracy, sexuality. Obviously, there's a big sex difference. More men are attracted to women and women to men. But really, most of our cognitive and emotional differences are quite modest. All right, so rather than Mars and Venus, some have proposed that might be a more accurate depiction. All right, so with that in mind, I want to give you a quick little primer on brain development, because when I started thinking about sex differences, my own background was in neural plasticity, or how the brain changes as a result of experience, and that has to be part of the equation when we consider children, and I want to sort of explain to you why I think that. So obviously, brain development begins quite early in utero. This is just prenatal development. And the brain develops like anything as a mix of nature and nurture. So on the nature side, we have genes and hormones. And on the nurture side, we have one's environment and experience, which I should point out begins even in utero. You know, the degree to which a child is nourished in utero, drug exposure, chemical exposure, all of that can affect brain development. But on the nurture side, we've adopted this word plasticity. You know, plastic is kind of an ugly thing. We don't like plastic toys, but let's face it, you can make a lot of stuff out of plastic. You can make toys and playground equipment and grocery bags and cars. So we've adopted this term neuroplasticity, which really does describe the fact that our brains are incredibly malleable. And there's really two little rules you need to remember for how the brain changes as a result of experience. So if you have two neurons, red neuron here, green neuron, you know, a neuron's kind of got a structure like a tree. It's not a brick like a liver cell. It's got this big branching domain, the dendrites, and then an output side, the axon, and electricity literally flows along the axon and then synapses on the next cell. And what we see is that cells that fire together wire together. So early in development, well, throughout life, but especially early in development, experiences that happen repeatedly actually strengthen the connections. And so we have a sprouting of additional connections in neurons that receive persistent stimulation. And then conversely, we have a use it or lose it phenomenon. So if synapses are not activated by early experience, they literally get pruned away. And the best example of this that you'll all be familiar with is language. So whatever language a newborn baby is immersed in, that's the one they're going to grow up speaking, with the same accent and dialect as their parents. And you can adopt a kid from halfway around the world, and they will grow up sounding like their adoptive parents. But obviously, if you're not exposed to certain speech sounds, it becomes a lot harder to learn those later on once the pruning has taken place. And that's the sad news about why it's harder for us to learn a foreign language after puberty. So this synaptic plasticity is far more potent in early life than later on. And the reason for that is, as I'll show you, because of synaptic density. But this, how do we know this? Okay, so the best evidence for this neuroplasticity comes from the development of vision. So vision, you know, that's a long way from gender. But you have to appreciate that even your ability to see depends on experience. I mean, why that? If something's going to be hardwired, why wouldn't it be vision, right? I mean, you got two eyes, you got to see the world. Why not just open those eyes and the little cameras go back to the brain and the baby sees exactly what's out there in the world? Doesn't work that way. It's the baby's visual experience from the moment of birth that wires up the circuits that allow you to perceive depth and angle and motion. And so we see that in the visual part of the brain back here, the occipital lobe, this is from experiments done on monkeys. Same work has now been done on cats and rats and applies to humans. You see this zebra pattern, and these black and white stripes in the visual cortex show input from the left eye, right eye, left eye, right eye. The two eyes evenly divide up cortical territory. However, if a child or an animal is raised with one eye closed, and this happens if a child is born with a congenital cataract, which is not common, but it does happen, or crossed eyes and the baby ends up squinting and it's not treated, what you see is this very uneven representation in cortex. The eye that was closed, the black stripes, loses real estate. And if you wait too long, the baby will actually remain blind in that eye, functionally blind. We want to detect visual problems early in babies because this is treatable, but it just proves how early development is irreversible for wiring up the cerebral cortex. And so this is just the visual part of the cortex, but every other part of the cortex follows the same rules. Motor development, touch development, social emotional, language, etc. follows exactly the same rules. So the visual system actually develops quicker than everywhere else. The number of synapses reaches its peak by about 12 months of age, and so we want to treat babies' visual problems if they have them within the first couple years of life, hopefully. And if you wait until after 8 years of age, a child with a visual problem, unfortunately, you can't do a whole lot for their vision at that point. Fortunately, other parts of the brain develop more quickly, so the frontal lobe has a slower development, and really it's through the end of adolescence. So it gives us a little more time to work with, which is important because there's obviously a lot of key learning that takes place in adolescence. So I just wanted to point out that this pruning of synapses in the frontal lobe actually corresponds quite well to what we know as the critical period for language. So as I mentioned, if you learn a language early in life, you'll have no difficulty. But if you try to pick up a language later on, you can learn the words, you can learn the grammar, but you'll probably speak with an accent because of the fact that your brain's already been routed for one language and everything else has to kind of overlay on top of that. So we know children most easily acquire language if they're immersed up to about age 7. And then after that age, they show an increasing degrees of accent if they pick it up later on. So interesting, given that there are verbal and literacy differences between boys and girls, that parents, we like to think we're gender equal. Hopefully, if you come away with nothing else today, you'll understand there's no such thing as gender neutral parenting or gender neutral anything. We always know gender in the back of our minds when we're interacting with another person. And so this is a meta-analysis that found that mothers actually talk more to their daughters than to their sons. Now, fathers haven't been studied as much, so we don't have enough data on a meta-analysis, but from the date of this study, 98, more mothers are interacting than fathers with the children. And so you see that girls are getting more verbal stimulation early in life. Guess what? There's a reading and writing gap in school, and it's starting very, very early because we're not giving boys the immersion that they need. We're not talking to them enough, and we're not reading to them enough. This was a nice large study, not a meta-analysis, but 1,000 children were studied at 18 months of age, and female gender, as well as being the first-born child, were significantly associated with more reading to your child than if you're a boy or a later born. So if you have babies, read to your sons, read to your daughters and your sons. Okay, so this just kind of makes the point that during this early, really plastic period in development, we have incredible influence of many things going on. Certainly the parents, peers, media. Essentially, boys and girls, I would argue, are growing up in two different cultures. There's a different way of talking, there's a different way of gesturing, there's obviously differences in interest and dress. And those are going to promote the development of different skills. So it's kind of a simple model. It's probably pretty intuitive, but the idea is that nature provides a bias for gender development, but then it's really nurture that trains the skills. We're not hardwired with any of these things. If things kind of cycle on their own, you have these self-fulfilling gender differences. But what we do in education, anyway, is we tend to counteract children's tendencies to go off on their own gender track. So just left free running, our culture, the type of play we have, and interaction with same-gender peers, as well as once kids are aware of their gender, once they know they're a boy or girl, they're often very fervently reinforcing their boyness or girlness. So kids are driving a lot of this. I'm not pretending they're not. But what we do in society is we kind of counteract this, and this is the purpose of education. So I do think from my research that prenatal testosterone is producing a biasing effect. It's not a huge difference, but it does orient boys, especially towards greater physical activity. So boys are moving around more. beginning in the second year of life. And that's one reason we probably don't read to them as much. They just don't sit still. But you got to find your moment. And so I think that activity level difference contributes to boys' spatial skills. Girls do mature physiologically about 2 weeks earlier than boys, if you look at newborn reflexes and so on. And then we see that sort of growing and growing by the time they start school. And I think that is contributing to the verbal difference along with. But there's no evidence linking prenatal testosterone to verbal skills, which I think is kind of interesting. Anyway, so this is what we're doing in education is essentially, I think we need to sort of cross-train kids for what their natural biases would drive them towards. All right, so with that said, I do want to kind of bring you up to speed a little bit about what's known about sex differences in the brain. Actually, what I'm going to do for the most part here is debunk a lot of popular theories about sex differences in the brain. What I left out, in fairness, is the one piece of evidence we do have for a sex difference in the brain, which is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It's about the size of a dime. Controls a lot of our reproductive behavior. It controls kind of all of our autonomic behavior, your thirst and hunger, your vegetative stuff, your controlling body temperature, but it also controls reproductive behavior. And there's one little nucleus in the hypothalamus called INAH3. Sorry, I don't have a slide of this. Interstitial nucleus. But Luann Brizendine has written a whole book about it, if you want. And this nucleus, which is 1/10 of a millimeter in diameter, is twice as large in men than women. It's a difference that's been linked to prenatal testosterone. It's still not totally clear how that relates to gender identity or sexual orientation, but nonetheless, it's sensitive to testosterone, and it's related to reproductive behavior. So the hypothalamus is involved in reproduction. But what about the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain? And so here we have a bunch of myths that I hope I can dispel for you. So one is this idea that men and women differ in the degree to which we use our two hemispheres. And this idea is that women tend to use both hemispheres to talk and think, and men tend to use one or the other. And here it's popularized on this website for if you want to send your daughter to a girls' school, you'll go to Girls Learn Differently and hear about this hardwired difference. But it turns out it's not true. So this idea is based on the idea that there's a difference in the corpus callosum, this white structure, white matter that is literally the highway that connects your two hemispheres. So it was thought that the corpus callosum is larger in women, which would allow this whole brain multitasking kind of thinking. But it turns out this was the very first meta-analysis of sex difference in the brain. It was done way back 20 years ago. So the first study of corpus callosum found a large sex difference. Negative, of course, is higher in women. And so that found a big sex difference in the corpus callosum. But what this shows is a cumulative meta-analysis. So as additional studies are added to the mix, the effect size, as you can see, went to 0. There is no sex difference when you add all these studies together in the size of the corpus callosum. Okay, and similarly, if you just look at activity level, okay, we've got thousands of studies of humans in brain scanners. You ought to be able to know whether women are bilateral and men are one or the other hemisphere. So this is a good-sized study, about 300 participants, half men and half women, and you see that there is a small but significant difference in lateralization. Both men and women are left lateralized, but men are more so than women. However, if women were actually not lateralized, if we really use both hemispheres, the peak should be over here, right, over 0. But no, we're both left lateralized. Men are statistically more so than women. But I think this just points out that the size of the brain difference is pretty similar to the size of all these other behavioral differences we're talking about, like language and math and emotion and so on. Also, there's been a lot of other studies using electrophysiological methods that find that sex or gender basically accounts for at most 2% of the variance. So we're all different in the degree to which we use left and right hemispheres. And within the whole huge population, sex accounts for just 2% of that variance, maybe 1%. All right, and I did a similar study looking at a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is dissected here by my medical students. It's in your temporal lobes. It's about the size of your pinky, and it's responsible for memory. Women do have better verbal memory than men, and the rumor was that women had a larger hippocampus than men. But we did a meta-analysis. We're just published online. It's going to come out in press in paper in 2016, that the human hippocampus is not dimorphic. We looked at 30 studies that reported the size of the hippocampus. Now, whenever you're looking at brain sex differences, you always have to correct for the fact that men are bigger than women, and so there's about a 10% size difference, which is the same in the heart and the kidney and the liver and so on. But if you really want to know, do women have a larger hippocampus than men, you have to look at studies that correct hippocampal size for total brain size. And in fact, if you look at uncorrected studies, the hippocampus is larger in men. It's about a 0.5 standard deviation, because everything in the brain is larger in men. But if you look at hippocampus corrected for overall brain size, you see this is no difference. This would be larger in women. This is larger in men. Each of these is an individual study. So there's scatter in the individual studies, but the overall effect size is not different, even though the rumor in the literature is that women have a larger hippocampus. And here's one more study making a similar point. This is looking at the connectome. Maybe you've heard about the big brain imaging movement funding that the NIH put out recently. We're trying to map every connection in the human brain. Well, this is a first pass, and you see that when you have enough participants, this is 1,400 people, because it takes a lot of people to see a small difference. We do see that there are some pink areas and some blue areas. The pink areas are areas of the brain that are more highly connected in women. Blue areas are more highly connected in men. But this is just a statistical difference. Everybody's got connections here. It's just women have a little bit more. And so if you look within the pink area, what you see is the population of women is distributed like this. The population of 700 men is distributed like that. And so there's a lot more overlap than difference. So there are statistical differences. They match the size of the behavioral differences, but it's certainly not what we would consider a categorical difference. We're not different species. We're not from different planets. And what's interesting about this sex difference in connectivity is that it's found in adults, but it has not been found in adolescents. So looking at exactly the same measure, here's another study. Granted, it's only 238 boys and girls, but you see the red and the blue are girls and boys, and there actually was no sex difference in the same measure of connectivity in adolescents. So I want to remind you that if you do see a sex difference in adults, you need to ask yourself, does that really prove anything about nature or nurture? Because by the time you're 25 years old and getting a brain scanner, you've lived 25 years as a boy or girl. That's a lot of different wiring that's happened for your synapses. All right, so another take-home message I'd like you to remember is that just because you see a sex difference in the brain, and just because the brain is biological, still doesn't mean that this is a hardwired innate difference. So I have a little thought experiment, which is kind of fun since it's Sunday morning. There's two subjects in a scanner. This is a real study, but I'm misleading you a little bit. We're calling one subject X and the other subject Y. They are asked to perform a task of moral reasoning. So they're given a hypothetical scenario and asked to decide if a person behaved morally or immorally, or morally or not. And you see subject X shows really strong activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, subject Y, smaller activation on the frontal pole. And of course, I'm suggesting that subject X is female and subject Y is male, but in fact, in this study, this wasn't a study of gender, it was a study of culture. And in this study, subject X was an individual raised as a Christian, and subject Y was an individual raised as a non-believer. And so they have different ways of interpreting moral scenarios, as you might imagine, depending on. So I hope I hope you'll take away from this the idea that our gender learning is at least as potent as other forms of cultural learning in shaping the way brain functions. If religion can do this, imagine what playing with trucks and dolls and dressing in different clothes can do. All right, so this is in my book, Pink Brain, blue brain, which, is it Ed? Did I get your name? Yes, which Ed noticed the pink and the blue are reversed. A lot of people don't notice that. That's sort of deliberate. That's something we call the Stroop test to suggest that maybe there really isn't such a thing as pink brain, blue brain. But also I wanted to point out there's a couple other books that have made the same critique of brain sex. And so it's not just me. Rebecca Jordan-Young is at Barnard. Cordelia Fine, I love her title, Delusions of Gender, critiqued many of the same studies. And she's in Melbourne, Australia. All right, so let me then turn to the nurture side, which I'm sure will be familiar to you, but I just want to kind of reinforce why we must think about brain sex differences from a developmental point of view. So we like to think that we view our infants like this. We all strive for gender-neutral parenting, and we like to pretend that we don't notice whether a child's a boy or girl. And so there's been some studies that have cross-dressed babies, you know, dress a boy as a girl or give them the opposite name, or just dress them neutrally and see how parents respond. And lo and behold, we do find bias, that depending on what you believe a child is a boy or girl, you will react differently. And it's not just parents, even older children will do this. So it turns out that families, peers, teachers, and the larger culture, especially our implicit bias, which I'll talk about briefly, demonstrably shape children's gender aspirations. And so while we think we're looking at those gender-neutral babies, really what's going on in the back of our mind when we interact with a male or female is this sort of cultural view of what is a real man and what is a real woman. Britney Spears at Radio City. So social influences have been demonstratively linked to all of these sex differences. It doesn't mean they're the only influence. So I talked about prenatal testosterone, which I believe influences physical activity level, which in turn I think affects motor skill development. There's some evidence that spatial skills are influenced by prenatal testosterone. And physical aggression also seems to be related to prenatal testosterone. But on top of that are a lot of social impact, and so that's what I'm going to focus on right now. And so here's one study that looked at motor development, and this was done at NYU. Moms brought their 11-month-old babies into the lab. These babies were crawling but not quite walking, and they were asked to adjust the slope of this ramp. How steep do you think your baby would be willing to crawl down? And I mean, I know this looks crazy, right? But this is for real. This was just, we redrew it from the photograph in the paper. So what you don't know is that this is carpeted, and there's also a mesh net, so the baby can't fall off. But yeah, it's pretty amazing. Well, guess what? The moms of boys were quite accurate at how steep they would climb down, but the moms of girls underestimated. And in fact, boys and girls were equally brave, but moms assumed their daughters would not want to crawl down as steep. And this is backed up by a lot of studies out on the playground that parents will caution their daughters more than their sons if they climb high. I myself have taken all of my kids to the ER for stitches. And I can tell you that that there's a big, hushed reaction when your daughter comes in with a facial laceration. Do we call the plastic surgeon? Whereas the son, it's like, scar will give him character. So we definitely have different expectations. And I'm very curious. I'm actually working on a book about gender integration. What would happen if girls and boys stayed together in athletics until puberty? Because there's really no physical reason for separating them, but I believe we're probably suppressing girls' athletic development by having them not compete against the boys. If you really want a proof that parents are not gender neutral, you got to ask Google, right? Because everything is there in our Google searches, all of our privacy. No, this was an anonymous Google searches, but this economist published this in the New York Times a year ago, actually going on 2 years ago, looking at parents' searches for, is my child a genius? Is my child intelligent? And lo and behold, they're about twice as likely to ask those questions of a son than a daughter. So twice as likely to ask if their son is a genius than their daughter, but 78% more likely to ask if their son is intelligent etc. Well, they're worried about them being stupid too. But and what do we ask about for girls? Beauty, looks, exactly. We're about twice as likely to ask if she's fat. That's not shown here. 160% as likely to ask if she's ugly, etc. And so, you know, this may be 2015, but we ain't there yet with the gender-neutral rearing. So, you know, you can just walk into the store and see this. We've got birth congratulation cards for brilliant boys and beautiful girls. We've got coloring books for brilliant boys and beautiful girls. And they can even color in different crayons, which are either called chocolate or princess. I mean, everything is gender now. It's really gotten worse. I mean, my kids are around 20 years old, but I really believe it's gotten much worse in the last 20 years. You know, why the heck? We didn't used to have different building blocks, but it just sends this message to kids: you are different. You are different. You are different. You are different from the. You know, you can't even play with the same blocks. And sure enough, you know, 25 years ago. 35 years ago, wow. When Legos first crossed the ocean from Sweden, they were marketed towards boys and girls. It was considered a gender-neutral toy. They came in primary colors. This was an ad from those days. And now, about 85% of Lego sets are purchased for boys. So Legos are pretty much the best spatial skill training you can have when you're little. You have a two-dimensional diagram. You have to translate that into a three-dimensional block. I mean, we're talking architecture, engineering, you know, calculus, surgery. There's a lot of three-dimensional skills that that girls would really benefit from. But today's girls get these girly Legos, the Friends set, which, if you've seen them, have much simpler building, more scripted play, and worst of all, the actual characters. I mean, these aren't the actual characters, but the figures are not those squat guys. They have to be tall and skinny because, you know, we can't start teaching anorexia too early to our daughters. All right. I love this. I took a couple of weeks ago at Costco, you know. Like, yeah, girls are actually taking as many math classes in high school as boys. There's no difference in calculus enrollment. They're not quite there in physics, but every other math class and science, they're equal. And yet, you know, we have these bubblegum calculators for them. Boys get to use the real thing, which the professional scientists may be using, but I don't know. We just are reinforcing gender everywhere we turn. And I love this one. Someone sent this to me. If your daughter is interested in astrophysics, you can get her a telescope, a pink telescope, but unfortunately it only has 90 power magnification. If the black one has 500 power. So anyway, I think hopefully I've convinced you we're a long way from gender neutrality. And there was a nice article about this in the Boston Globe earlier this year, I think, about, you know, how extreme it's gotten. And I do think we're at a turning point a little bit. You might have heard Target is going to take the labels off. They're not going to call it the boy toys and the girl toys anymore. So I'm very hopeful, and I actually think the whole transgender movement is going to help break down gender barriers. I think if nothing else, the bathrooms are the first site to go. So I'm very happy to be alive in this time, and anxious and curious to see how it goes. I hope we can break down these barriers more. So I just want to end with some social science data that maybe, hopefully, is familiar to some or many of you. Have you heard of implicit bias or the Project Implicit at Harvard? Anybody done any of these tests in your work? Or I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in one of his books. But this is work that's been going on for a couple of decades now, and luckily it's all online. You can do these tests that measure your reaction time associating either gender or race or different attributes of individuals with words. And they point out that, so you can do this implicit association. And by just looking at your reaction time, it's not asking overtly, are you racist, are you sexist? Just how quickly can you associate stereotypes and anti-stereotypes? And so there's a couple of them that pertain to gender. One has to do with men and women's names with career words versus home family words, and the other has to do with men and women's names versus science words or humanities words. So I'm going to talk about the second one. What you do is you log on. These tests only take about 5-10 minutes. They're kind of fun. You're going to see a number of names, girl names or male names, and then you're going to see words associated with the liberal arts, philosophy, humanities, arts, music, etc., or sciences. And you just have to press a button on the keyboard to see how quickly you can associate these. And it turns out that everybody, male or female, are much faster at making the stereotypical association. So 70% of us have an easy time associating male names with science and female names with liberal arts, and only about 10% of people make the opposite association. Well, you know, you might argue, oh, that's just a stereotype. We're all aware of the stereotypes that women go into humanities and men go into science. But there's actually international database that looks at all the people around the world that have done this test, and they know your nationality. It's all, you don't have to put your name in, but you do have to put in your age and your nationality and a few other things. And it turns out that countries where you see a bigger bias on this test, the boys have a bigger math advantage. And countries, there's actually a few countries in the world where girls are outperforming boys on average in math, and those are the countries with the lowest levels of implicit bias. So it's in the air, and the kids are kind of picking it up from attitudes. And how do we know this? Well, this has actually now been done with third graders, or maybe second graders, 7 or 8-year-old kids. A version of the implicit association test was made for children, and they just had to associate boy names with math or girl names. Well, first, there's two parts. Either you make the stereotypical association, so they had to press the left button for a boy word or a math word. They had to press the right button for a girl word or a reading word. And then they reversed them. You had to press the left button for a boy word and a reading, and a girl word with a math. And both boys and girls are faster at pushing the buttons on this test than they are pushing the buttons on this test. And interestingly, so this happens in 7 or 8-year-old kids, which is before you even see a performance difference in school. So they've internalized the stereotype even before they see who's good at what in their classrooms. So that's one example of how this implicit association influences us. And let me just end very quickly on my sort of personal bandwagon right now, which is to get us to be thinking more mindfully about the gender segregation in our society. And so there's a area of psychology called developmental intergroup theory that has shown that segregation, and this is obviously done in the context of racial segregation, promotes stereotyping, whereas intergroup contact reduces it, and that's why we strive for diversity these days. And children in particular figure out what categories are important from our parents. So this is a really neat study done by a colleague of mine, Becky Bigler, who's at University of Texas. You may have heard of it. Kids came to summer school, and they were either given blue t-shirts or red t-shirts. And in half the classrooms, the teachers didn't say anything about the t-shirts. In the other half of the classrooms, the teachers kind of made a big deal of the blue and the red. They divided kids up. Blue kids sit at this table, red kids sit at this table. Blue kids line up first, red kids line up over here. You know, I need a blue kid to help me erase the blackboard, that kind of thing. And lo and behold, after just a month of this summer school, the blue kids and the red kids hated each other. I mean, the blue kids thought the red kids were stupid and mean, and, you know, and vice versa. And all the teachers did was refer to them by t-shirt color. So what do we do all the time? We say boys and girls, boys and girls, boys and girls line up, boys and girls. I need you to help me. Imagine, Becky points out, if we said, oh, good morning, blacks and Latinos. How are you today? You know, we don't do that, right? So, you know, we need to be really careful about the labels that we use. Why do we say boys and girls all the time? So this was a study with preschoolers, similar, where the teachers, only it was done with gender. The teachers in half of the preschool treated kids normally. The teachers in the other half were asked for just 2 weeks, 10 days, to use boy and girl labels a lot. So to line boys and girls up separately. They had a bulletin board for boys and a bulletin board for girls. you know, not saying anything explicit about who's good at what, but just using the words boys and girls a lot and dividing kids. And they saw that compared to the control classroom where there was no change, there was a noticed reduction in children's gender flexibility. So their understanding of what you can be when you grow up, who can you be best friends with, and that kind of thing was affected just by the way the teachers referred to gender in the classroom. I won't go through all this in detail, but this is what I'm thinking about these days is what is actually the evidence for true, the benefits of gender inclusion. And we do have from studies of siblings that older brothers do influence their younger sisters' physical and spatial skills, and vice versa for older sisters with verbal and relational skills. There's been large studies in classrooms showing that the more girls in the classroom, the better the academic growth of both boys and girls. So that kind of really rules out the boys' school movement right now. Now, there's still a big push on the girls' schools, but we can talk about that later. High schools with larger density of mixed-sex friendship actually have lower levels of aggression. Oh, this was a large study in Britain. So Britain has a long history of single-sex schooling. And there's not a lot of difference in academic outcome, but one outcome of this large cohort found that men who went to co-ed schools were less likely to be divorced than men who attended single-sex. And the idea is that this is an opportunity to learn about relationships. So this is something that's being studied more widely. There's some intervention efforts at Arizona State University to actually teach teachers to promote boy-girl interactions. We've got a little buddy program. The kids are buddied up, boy-girl, every week with a different partner, just for part of the day. But you know, kids that hate each other at the beginning of the week or don't want to talk to each other are becoming friends and reading together and so on. And also in 5th grade, they're finding nice effects on social skills. And then, of course, in the workplace, and this is my last slide, there's growing research finding the benefits of diversity in the workplace for innovation, for the bottom line, but also not just racial or ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity. We're waiting for this to filter into the military. Military has to integrate by January 1st, and one problem, according to this author, is the fact that the men and women are still going through basic training separately. So until they integrate their training, they're going to have a hard time. All right, so I've told you that sex differences in the brain and abilities are real but subtle, with much more overlap than difference. And I think that the progress that girls and women have made is really the best testimony to neuroplasticity. I mean, look at where girls have come in sports and work. But now we haven't done that for boys. We have not broadened the latitude. If anything, I feel like we've narrowed the definitions of what is appropriately masculine. And there's a nice film out now called The Mask You Live In that talks about the constrained world of boys. You know, all their behavior is ruled by not appearing girly or gay. And so you don't see boys on student council, and you're not seeing boys in the writing for the yearbook and the newspaper, and all these things that boys and girls used to do. Once the girls moved in, the boys have moved out. And every high school is different, but that's sort of a trend going on. So I hope that you come away with the sense that gender segregation is still present at all ages and limits us as individuals and society. So thank you so much. Love to have some questions.
Thanks for the interesting and humorous talk. I'm wondering, most of the reporters were mothers. Do you know of any studies that had boys raised by women and by mothers and girls raised by fathers, now that this is more prevalent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a limitation of the data that, you know, most of the information is coming from mothers, or interactions or study between mothers and babies. You know, that's kind of who's available for these things. But let me think. the biggest data about differences between fathers and mothers, this isn't exactly addressing your point, is that when it comes to toy preference, fathers are more rigid than mothers about sons playing with girl things. Now, as far as what's the effect of the other gender parent, there really isn't a lot of good research. However, newborn, or not newborn, but young infants show a preference for the female voice over the male voice. However, babies whose primary caregiver is their dad show the opposite preference, so that's kind of reassuring. And this is just totally anecdotal, but I have noticed, well, it is known that men who are fathers of daughters become more feminist. There's a study of Supreme Court justices. If they have grown daughters, their views tend to move more to the left than if they have no daughters. And it certainly is my impression that daughters whose fathers take a very keen interest in their achievement, athletic, academic, seem to especially benefit from that. So.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. In the toy industry, there was a story that was going around about boys, girls, and boys' toys and girls' toys, and was a pink shotgun a girl's toy, so forth. And there was a story that
Absolutely, a pink shotgun is a girl's toy.
Okay, the question is, the story was that there was a little girl whose parents did not give her a doll. And one day they saw her with a blanket, and she was cooing to something in the blanket as it was a doll, and they unwrapped it, and it would happen to be a truck.
Yeah, I usually get that, a version of that story from most people. That the son was given a doll and he was beating her against the wall or something like that. Certainly, you know what, toy choice is one of the biggest sex differences. It actually is way over a standard deviation, and but not in infancy. It happens beginning about age 2 or especially about age 3. So age 3 is when boys and girls know that they're boys and girls. And if you put a kid in a toy room with nobody watching, they will explore many things. But if there's somebody watching, doesn't matter who's watching, whether it's a man or a woman or boy or girl, they will go more towards the gender appropriate toy. And also you see that boys show a much higher preference for boy-specific toys than girls do, especially by the time girls are in kindergarten. They go through this pink phase at 4, and then they get to be 5 and 6, and girls actually start splitting their time between, quote, boy toys and girl toys, whereas boys won't touch anything pink. And so, there's an asymmetry in how much we discourage boys. That said, there is, I think, some pretty good evidence that prenatal testosterone favors the interest in moving toys, so balls and trucks. And the reason I say it is because there's a population of girls who are exposed to high levels of testosterone before birth. They have a genetic defect. Their adrenal glands are actually making too much testosterone. They may have physical manifestations of that in the genitalia. And those girls are shifted. Their toy preference is sort of halfway between typical boys and typical girls. So there's something going on, but society really ramps it up, I think, is my interpretation. Yeah.
Do you think if it was possible at all to raise children in a truly neutral fashion, from birth, you have a girl twin and a boy twin, and somehow parents managed, or whoever managed, not to express any preferences, would they be similar? Would they have similar interests, both, let's say, in math and art?
I think they'd be more similar. I don't think we'll ever be identical. I mean, there definitely are effects of genes and hormones on the brain, but it's just a question of small versus big. And we're certainly seeing, girls move into math and science. And my favorite example is veterinary science. 20 years ago, is it 20? 80% of graduating vets were male, and now 80% are women. So we have these fields that we think are linked directly to our interests or our, innate concerns, when in fact so much in our society has a gender label. Almost every job has a gender label. You could, 70% of jobs are have a predominance of males or females. There's very few that are actually 50-50. So I don't think we will ever get to gender neutral rearing. But what's the word? We want to be inclusive with gender as opposed to binary. And in reality, gender is a spectrum. All of these traits we're talking about are a complete rainbow. The LGBT picked a rainbow years ago, and that is really, I think, where we are with men and women, men being here and women being here. So there's a lot of overlap, but differences at the extremes.
Thank you for a great talk. So I'm a mom of male twins and a sociologist, so I'm very interested in gender bending and gender neutrality. So I'm wondering about this idea of prenatal testosterone. So I would assume that women have different amounts of that in circulation during pregnancy. And are there any studies done of fraternal twins, one being a boy and one being a girl, and the effects of that?
Yeah.
If there's any, does that bear out?
Right.
Or is it really about the amount of prenatal testosterone, which would vary from mother to mother, I assume?
Well, so boys, there isn't, there are a lot of correlates between, between like amniotic levels of testosterone and later behavior. There are studies that have looked at these correlates, and it's turned out to have a relationship for toy preference, for aggression, physical activity level, not for verbal skills. The opposite sex twin thing is fascinating. I spent a lot of time researching. There's been a bunch of studies done of opposite sex twins, and there are a few like physiological things you see in girls with male twins. So the idea being that there's some testosterone transfer between the babies. Girls with male twins have larger teeth, and there's this autoacoustic emission. Our newborn baby's hearing test is testing this little echo, essentially, our ears produce. Girls have larger autoacoustic emissions than boys. Girls with male twins have intermediate autoacoustic emissions. But there's been a lot of studies that looked at girls with male twins looking at their play preferences. There's no girls with male twins have very typical girl toy preference. So if they're exposed to testosterone, it must be just a tiny bit, or socialization largely overweighs that. When it comes to behavior specifically, the opposite twin studies have come up blank. There is no evidence that behavioral shifts happen if you have a male twin. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. I had a question. I remember when my daughter was in preschool, one of her teachers telling me that something interesting she learned was that the brains of boys develop from the back to the front, and the girls develop front to back, and that explained their...
She learned, her teachers told her that?
In her continuing education class. She thought it was one of the most interesting things she'd learned. And that explained why boys were more active, that the frontal lobe developed later, and that's why they had more poor decision-making in teenage years.
That's not
My question was whether,
no.
Listening to all of your conversations today, yes.
I think she got that from Gurian. I will say, and most parents will testify, their sons have less behavioral control. It's one of the bigger sex differences. At the start of first grade, there's measures of behavioral inhibition, which basically how well can you sit still in your class and not speak out of turn and that kind of thing. Girls, there's a whole standard deviation different at the start of school. Girls mature more quickly than boys. You know that if you've been at middle school lately. You see the girls are about 1 to 2 years ahead of boys. And so that's a trajectory we see throughout early childhood, and it's going to affect classroom behavior. But the same the maturation is the same. It's just a little bit slower for boys than girls. It is back to front for everybody. We start with our sensory abilities, and the frontal lobe is still maturing into our 20s.
Could you talk a bit about transgender and what's really going on?
Yeah.
Is this biological? Is it cultural? Is it...
Right. That is the $60 million question right now. I've written an article I hope to publish soon because there's been about a dozen or so decent studies of transgender people's brains. And at the moment, the data aren't overwhelmingly to say that like a transgender woman was born a female brain in a male body. There's a few studies that are seeing a little bit of a shift, but basically the brain sex differences are so small that seeing these kinds of shifts is going to be hard. But I don't believe, well, the issue is gender is a spectrum, right? But these categories are binary. So a person has to make this 180-degree shift if they decide to be transgender, because society says if you're not X, you're Y. So my view is that gender is a spectrum. All these traits I described to you are present in men and women to different degrees. And a child is born and they're called a boy or called a girl based on their genitals primarily. And if a child doesn't feel right about that, you know, if he's called a boy, but gosh, he sure likes pink sparkly things and he's not very aggressive or doesn't like sports, and suddenly he realizes, well, I'm not this, there's only one other choice, I must be that. And so he very early, you know, cognitively makes this decision and reorients himself and grows up, and maybe he plays more with girls and does girl things. Maybe the parents are supportive. And so then, you know, it becomes the logical choice. If you can only be one or the other feels right to that person. So that's my current take. You know, it's very dangerous when you talk about social influences on gender identity. But I just think it's an artifact. And there are other cultures that identify more than two genders. So certain Native American cultures had at least 3 genders, others have 4. You know, I don't know if I answered your question, but for example, the dominant hypothesis is that transgender people, so I told you prenatal testosterone masculinizes behavior. So everybody says, every article about transgender will say, the genitals are formed in the first trimester, the brain is formed in the second trimester. So something happens in the second trimester where a boy, for example, doesn't get enough testosterone, or a girl gets too much, and so they're born with this shifted. There is not one piece of empirical evidence to support that. You can do it to rats. You can change their behavior by changing prenatal testosterone, but nobody's ever shown that a transgender person received the wrong hormone exposure, if you will. And intersex kids, so people, these are people born with ambiguous genitalia who we have documented alterations in prenatal testosterone exposure. Not that many of them are actually transgender. Some are, but not as many as you would expect based on that theory. So that's where I stand on that right now. Thanks. Yeah.
Earlier you showed a slide where it showed where girls outgrow aggression before boys do.
Yeah.
Is that the case with other primates?
With other primates, I don't really know about, I mean, rough and tumble play, well, I mean, we're the only species that probably socializes our, well, actually, I take that back. Rough and tumble play is common in all mammals, okay, and it's more common among males than females in other primates, in rodents, etc. But they all grow out of it by adulthood. So, and it's thought that rough and tumble play is a really important social learning. That's where you kind of test the limits of a person's sensitivity, and you actually develop increased sensitivity for another person by kind of pushing them. So everybody grows out of it in all species, and as far as whether and females engage in it less than males. I'm not aware of developmental studies of males versus female monkey aggression. That's a good question, though. Thanks.
Really enjoyed your talk. I just want to follow up on your transgender hypothesis.
Okay.
Do you think that gender stereotypes are possibly causing children to think they are another gender because people are so unwilling to allow, for example, a little boy who wants to play with a doll or wear a dress? If we were more gender neutral, that these kids would not necessarily feel like they even need to have have a surgery that forces them to be another gender?
I think that for, I don't know. I don't know at this point. But I think that children clearly have this cognitive thing that's going on with them. I'm a boy or I'm a girl. And when there's only two choices, and the one doesn't feel right, they divert to the other. I think if there was no gender label at all, then I think they probably wouldn't care so much about what genitals. I mean, actually, I was surprised to learn that a majority of transgender people don't have the bottom surgery. You know, so it's not that they're rejecting their genitals necessarily. It's the identity that they're seeking. So, you know, I know I'm treading on difficult territory right now, but I'm still trying to understand this myself. And I think that this binary thing we do to kids takes children who don't fit into one. I mean, we know kids are gender bullied. That's the leading cause of gender bullying for all boys and girls. But you know, it's almost like a kind of gender bullying to young kids if you're creating a really stereotyped expectation that is not comfortable for him or her. So.
Okay. I know we have a lot more questions than we have time to get to. We probably can take one or two more, and Dr. Eliot will be available during the coffee hour to talk with everybody and answer more questions one-on-one.
And I would like to say that, like I said, I'm trying to work this out in my mind, and I would love to hear from anybody that's really thought more about this transgender thing, and you know, challenge me, and let's try and figure this out.
So to some extent, buying blue things for some of my kids and pink things for another kid feels like a first world thing. And if I was poor, I probably don't do that. So I'm wondering what we know about just in less wealthy countries. Mm-hmm. How does this play out where that's just not, that we can't signal it with so many things? And similarly, just internationally, like Scandinavian countries and more, Middle Eastern countries and things, how these different, do we see more evidence of plasticity or less in stronger, more different kinds of cultural norms?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is no such thing as a gender-free culture. Even Scandinavia, you know, you have pretty clearly different gender roles, in part because of the maternity leave is so generous that women are out of the workforce for longer periods. So that said, like if you think of a very, you know, a culture without Toys R Us, there's still very clearly defined gender roles. You have a son, you have a daughter, the expectations are different from the get-go, that your daughter will be helping to babysit and your son will be out taking care of the cows, you know. There's no such thing as a gender-free society, so I don't think the experiment can be done. Certainly Scandinavian countries are trying to be more gender neutral, but there's a lot of controversy about a school that was trying to remove the pronouns, the male and female pronouns, and I don't know how far they got, but thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.